The Vietnam War.
3 months ago, the 1st Air Cavalry Division shipped out from Charleston, South Carolina. Young men trained in a new concept of war. Proud, sure of themselves, but still to be tested in battle. They were destined for the high country of central Vietnam.
The Vietnam War was the longest war for the United States, and it led to an estimated 60,000 American and 2 million Vietnamese casualties. It is also the only war that ended in defeat for the United States. The war split the United States into two: the pro-war Hawks and the anti-war Doves. The United States' main goal was to make sure that South Vietnam did not have a communist government. However, the U.S. policy of containment was not successful, and South Vietnam ultimately fell to communism. America's involvement in Vietnam was very controversial and is still debated today. The United States originally was not involved in the war, so the government came up with a story that they were attacked in order to have a reason to become involved. The story was about the Gulf of Tonkin, which was a naval battle between the United States and Communist North Vietnam. The Vietnam War took place during the Cold War, which is when the United States was trying to stop the spread of communism. The division of Vietnam was a country in Asia that was split into two: North Vietnam, which was a communist government, and South Vietnam, which at the time was a non-communist government. The Soviet Union was supporting North Vietnam with weapons. North Vietnam won the war and ultimately annexed South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. South Vietnam then became communist and was also not allowed to have any. In order to learn more about the Vietnam War, I was fortunate to interview Lieutenant Colonel Don Evans. He was a pilot for many different types of aircraft that dropped napalm, carried supplies, and carried negotiators. One time, he was even shot down. I asked Lieutenant Colonel Evans many questions about his experience, including what his best and worst days were, what he missed from his time in the military, and if it was ever hard to leave to go to war. While Lieutenant Colonel Evans was training in California, the Cuban Missile Crisis had started.
I was a brand new second lieutenant, and we went aboard ship during the Cuban Missile Crisis and went down from California through the Panama Canal to Cuba. And then when that kind of died, we went back home again to California. And soon after that, in 1963, the squadron I was in deployed to Vietnam.
Vietnam, he mostly flew helicopters and then went home for a little bit in 1964. He again returned to Vietnam in 1967 and then was in an F-4 Phantom squadron, then went home for a little bit in 1969. Then he returned to Vietnam in 1972 and flew CH-46 helicopters. Lieutenant Colonel Evans liked all the aircraft that he flew, but in particular he enjoyed the Phantom because it was different. When flying the F-4 Phantom, he was doing close air support where he had to use napalm and snake-eye bombs, both released at very low altitude. Lieutenant Colonel Evans said that in Vietnam, those bombs were his bread and butter. The napalm was basically jellied gasoline. In 1963, when he started in Vietnam, his helicopters only carried supplies, because there were really no American ground troops on the ground yet, mostly only advisors with the Vietnamese army. The helicopter he flew would resupply the South Vietnamese army.
So everything that we took to the field, there was no refrigeration. So we carried live cows, small cows, fortunately, pigs, chickens, and ducks. And we load up a helicopter full of animals to carry out to the Vietnamese troops in the field, along with rice and some of their Vietnamese sauce.
Whenever they had troops in the age 34, they didn't have any seats, so they would sit on the floor and you could carry more people that way. They would just pick them up from the field, take them where they were going, and they would jump out, and that was the last they would see of them. In the Vietnam War, there were two sides: the Hawks and the Doves. The Hawks thought the war was necessary, and the Doves did not think the war was necessary.
When you're in the military, you support what you think of it. You support the commander in chief and the Constitution. We went because we were ordered to go, and you didn't really There were some people who later on, particularly later in the war, you thought it was kind of a waste because it was not being handled right. We thought we were doing the right thing.
Lieutenant Colonel Evans also said they were sent there to stop the spread of communism, and that's what they thought they were doing. When he wasn't flying during his early time in Vietnam, he was staying in an area now known as Da Nang and lived in a French Foreign Legion compound that was near the airfield. When he returned in 1967, he stayed at a base that was built strictly for the military called Chu Lai and lived in what was referred to as Southeast Asia huts. These huts had folding shutters and they were lucky to have running water. Then in 1972, he was aboard a ship which had all the comforts at home while aboard. His bases occasionally were rocketed with 122mm rockets and mortared. They hit Chu Lai pretty heavy and they lost a lot of planes to rockets. Near the end of the war, they carried negotiators in and out. When the war was over, Mr. Evans thought it was easy to return to regular daily activities because Marines were usually only deployed for 13 months and then came home for a couple of years. Even when the war was over in 1972, they went back into preparing for the next war and went back into training. His best memory or days from Vietnam was on an airplane coming home after being there for 13 months. One time, he was ejected out of an F-4 Phantom in 1964, and it was a good memory for him that he was picked up by the Air Force. He also liked near the end of the war when they were carrying negotiators in and out of Haiphong airfield, when they were negotiating for the release of all the prisoners of war. At that time, there was a truce, so there was not any bombing going on then. Then his worst days in Vietnam was when his plane got shot down and he was ejected, but those feelings passed after a few days. I was very lucky to get an idea on what it was like firsthand in Vietnam from Lieutenant Colonel Don Evans.